My name is Suzy Sikorski, and I'm an art researcher in Dubai and founder of Mideast Art, an online art platform. I have partnered with the UAE Embassy's Cultural Diplomacy Department in Washington, D.C. to produce a series of digital programming. As part of the Artist Reflection series featuring artist interviews from the US and UAE, I had a conversation between photographers Ammar Al Attar and Stephen Shore. Meeting each other in Abu Dhabi nearly 10 years ago in a workshop, both artists caught up with each other online during the quarantine, while our conversations were across Dubai, Sharjah, and New York. We found many parallels in their works as they capture the everyday scenes and details people don't normally notice, either across the US or UAE. From Andy Warhol's factory in the 1960s to iconic theaters and prayer rooms across the UAE. Both are self-taught photographers exhibiting internationally. Shore just celebrated a survey exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2017, while Ammar was most recently part of the Alberta Endowment exhibition this fall 2019 in Abu Dhabi. Ammar has two hats that he wears, both as a fine art photographer and also an archiver of his country's social history. He hoards in his Sharjah studio everything from slide projectors to large format cameras, orphan negatives, and documents salvaged from movie theaters and photo studios across the country. His practice seeks to document and archive certain aspects of Emirati culture and the larger UAE social fabric within today's rapidly changed landscape of the country. Stephen Shore is an American photographer based out of New York whose vast treasure troves of everyday snapshots has taken us on a road trip across the American landscape, which surely presents itself as a much-needed escape during this time in the quarantine. Alongside other artists, Stephen came to the forefront in the 1970s, capturing the mundane aspects of American pop culture and banal scenes, redefining the documentary tradition of photography, and he's known for his pioneering use of color at a time when it was new to serious photography circles. Stephen has been chronicling people and places with his much-beloved American Surfaces and Uncommon Places series of the 1970s and 80s. Shore's works teach us it is never too early to begin your passion, starting at the age of 6 when he was gifted a photographic darkroom kit. He was only 14 years old when he was presented his photos to Edward Steichen, the photography curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York at the time, when 3 of Shore's works were bought by him. In 1971, when Shore was only 23, he became the first living photographer to have a solo show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York since Alfred Stieglitz some 40 years earlier. Influencing the next generation of artists like Nan Goldin, Thomas Struth, Andrea Gursky, to Wolfgang Tillmans, his work has reverberated globally to those such as Ammar Al Attar. Both Stephen and Ammar share stories on Western photography history, the local UAE art scene, and their early exhibitions, as they adapt and evolve in a fast-paced and changing world we live in. Let's hear what shades of color Stephen and Ammar are seeing these days. I wanted to ask maybe a bit before we get into it, since we are in the quarantine, how has this time been for you? Has it been fruitful, both to Stephen and Ammar during this time?
I had this dream of, working from home, which happened during the pandemic, so I can get more time at home. And I built my own a dark room at home, so I can photograph and process myself, my black and white, and I had a lot of time, because we are sitting at home all the time. So I had lots of time to research about, new subject, because I think I'm in a way that I want to do something new.
Artists have known for ages that some restrictions, some limitations spur creativity.
Stephen, would you say you could think of a time at all comparable to this where it was in such restrictive measures, whether it was government enforced or personally enforced, that you felt in such a way that could be parallel to this?
Oh, definitely. I mean, for example, I'll just mention a couple of things. I never crop my pictures. So when I'm taking a picture, I know when I'm taking it, this is the way it's going to be. And if I make a mistake, if I don't like what I've done, I just don't use the picture. And I've done that for, well, since my Warhol days and before. So for more than 55 years. And still today, I tend to take one picture of anything. with the view camera, it was because of the expense and the laboriousness. But I find that even with a phone today, after 30 years of only using an 8x10 camera and only shooting one picture.
And Ammar, with you, with in terms of putting some restrictions.
Yeah, like I like always to experiment with whatever I have. I didn't have any digital camera because I sold all my cameras before last year. So I had to use like black and white and process the film myself. So I had to think, in a way to have the subject that I will shoot, it's in black and white.
I wanted to start, Stephen, in hearing more about your time in Abu Dhabi, how you enjoyed it, what you did when you were here. If you can share it with us, and I'll be able to go and scroll through some of the pictures that you were able to take during this time.
Well, I had two experiences in Abu Dhabi. The first was I was invited to do a slideshow for the opening night of the art fair. For me, the more interesting experience was a couple of years later being invited to do a workshop that Ammar participated in. And it was just a great experience getting to know the people whose background was so different from mine and who were so involved in and knowledgeable about art globally and committed to their practice.
What of the UAE was so special in terms of photographing when you did these street scenes?
Well, I think my answer is a visual answer. I mean, I'm interested in the style of architecture. I'm interested in the graphics, the graphic design, lettering, combinations of architecture. Mm-hmm. Of different styles and different periods.
In 2011, during the workshop, I was showing to Stephen and Tariq Al-Hussein, who was with us also in the workshop, the work that I was photographing. And I think initially I was photographing the scrapyard, which was in the Sharjah industrial area. Mm-hmm. And I think, at the moment, one of the moments and one of the editing our workshop discussions, Stephen told me that, okay, we have this work now, body of work of scrapyard. Now you are ready for the exhibition, but forget it and go around and take photograph of UAE. And imagine that you are sending these photographs to a friend as a postcard in America or somewhere. So I went around and I took these photographs, which is then actually these was exhibited, and we selected 24 pictures, which was exhibited in the exhibition, which I realized and I found out later that it was a base for my other projects that I focused on in the later years, like these pictures, like I took of this is in a studio and near my home. Some of them are in restaurants. Some of them, it's like very random, very thoughtful. As Stephen was always telling us, like as a photographer, we go around with attention. Like I was, walking in the industrial area, and I saw this man with a bike, and there's a TV on the bike. So, which rarely we see this scene. So I took this picture, and we, as a photographer, we always walk with attention to whatever happening around us. Mm-hmm. So that was the start of the Visual Diaries, and the Prayer Room series, which came after Visual Diaries, was actually one of the photographs that was part of Visual Diaries series, and also other series like Sabil Water, and even the Reverse Moment was one of the studio pictures which inspired me to do Reverse Moments. In my Prayer Room series, I wanted to document these prayer places where Muslims go and pray, and not the nice built mosque, which is there, but also the places that is sometimes is temporary, sometimes it's built in a like empty room in a building,
moving your attention around the photograph, you start to notice the parallels in certain objects and the reasoning of your position as to, the lines of where to lay, to pray. It starts to be apparent the more that you look at it, which I think is something very similar in terms of uncommon places. The more that you look at it, you start to see the lines all, making sense geometrically throughout, but it takes time to actually, it's like, what does seeing look like when you're looking at the photograph? So I thought would be great is to discuss the American Surfaces series that would, try to encapsulate things or surfaces that were taken during a road trip from Stephen that was from New York to Amarillo, Texas, visiting 19 states, showing that were eventually shown at Light Gallery in New York. And actually the curator Weston Nath purchased all of the works in the show and would later donate the works to the New York institution at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was basically showcasing this type of journey and vast empty roads, idiosyncratic window displays, meals atop of tables, dirty sheets, toilets, drab bedrooms. So it was a very interesting parallel, I think, to Ammar's visual diaries.
I became fascinated by the middle of America, and so saw myself as an explorer. This was new territory for me, and these trips were trips of exploration. The other aspect of it, particularly with American Surfaces, was I wanted to find a visual language that was that felt like more like seeing than like photographing, that it felt more like an unmediated experience of being there and seeing something.
And you had shot this on, it was a 35 millimeter color film and a Rolly 35?
Yes, which was a very small camera. It was sort of the equivalent in those days of a point and shoot camera. I owned a whole lot of other cameras, but I wanted a camera that wouldn't feel intimidating if I were photographing someone. So I photographed everyone I met on the trip, and I would say, "Can I take your picture?" And I would just be some guy in his early 20s with this little camera, and I wouldn't take out a Leica, and they would feel like I'm a serious photographer imposing on them.
I wanted to ask as well, when you were displaying in 2011 this work of visual diaries, was there many other photographers here exhibiting work like that? Was it something new you found of showcasing here in the UAE?
I was interested in documenting things, like documenting my life, taking street shots, moments, trying to take even normal moments that is reality for me. Then I showed some of these pictures, which at that time, I think some people, I was part of a photography society at that time. And some people, didn't, accept it because it was, maybe it wasn't that beautiful, maybe for them. Like it wasn't that, dreamy and with a nice, beautiful sky with the moving clouds, and which is fine. They like, if they like it like this. For me, I didn't find it interesting. For me, I find more interesting to take photograph in its reality, and it's whatever is there. I don't use a lot of Photoshop to edit, to remove things from my pictures. So that what also I learned from Stephen Shore or William Eggleton, and from other street photographers like Henry Cartier-Bresson, and these street photographers that really photograph the daily life that we live in.
This is something that Ammar and I have in common. This attraction to using photography to show a perception of the world, and not using photography to make a beautiful photograph. And that's an inherent difference of approach. That some photographers, I know they look at at the work of the approach that Ammar and I have, and comment. I see these comments on Instagram of, I don't understand why someone would take the picture of that. It's like the world. It's like life. Well, that's why.
Reality.
How important in your formative years was being able to document Warhol's factory?
It was important. I mean, I did it because it was the most exciting place in New York at the time. It was a lot more interesting for me than sitting in classes in school that I didn't have any interest in. And it wasn't my documenting it that was important to me as much as the experience of being there, that I can look back years later and see, having seen Andy working. He worked every day. A video camera was created, and he thought, what can I do with this? And so I think that was a very an important lesson. I think it's where I learned to think aesthetically.
I wanted to ask, I mean, you noted people need time to appreciate your work, which I think is the case for both of your work. And it's probably good advice in the UAE, especially in taking time to cultivate an art scene here. I wanted, Ammar, if you could briefly explain your art index series that you did, because in many ways, I mean, there is a parallel of at least trying to document and cultivate the art scene that started here, and how this has helped in understanding of the history of the art scene for you, Ammar.
Yeah, so Art Index for me was a project that I wanted to document. It's like taking like screenshot or capture of the art scene at that time. But when I started the Art Index, it's like documenting or taking portraits of artists and people who works in the art scene, like Abdul Sarkar, which is the owner or the founder of the Sarkar Art Foundation and the Sarkar Avenue, where all the galleries and in Dubai, most of the galleries, and going to artist studios and try to document some artists, one of the pioneer artists like Hassan Sharif, like in these pictures, like Dr. Najat Makki, and also Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim, these are pioneer artists in UAE who started the art movement in UAE, and to go to their studios, to stay with them for like half day and to document their studios, their practice, to see them how they work. And for me, it took like almost 2 years, to do this project. Like I was lucky to photograph Hassan Sharif, which is one of the first artist in UAE who started this modern art, and he has different concepts of art in UAE other than the traditional, like the way of painting and this, which was there in the 70s in UAE. And he started this new thing. I always take advices, especially from artists like Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim.
Mm-hmm.
I always still I go to a studio, visit him from time to time.
Once in a while, I get a comment on Instagram, as I mentioned before, why are you even photographing this? But sometimes they will go on to say, why did you give up the wonderful work I love so much of yours from the 70s and do the crap that you're doing today? And that was the same kind of comment I got in the 70s. Why are you doing these pictures? And they're seeing it now as some distant past that becomes romanticized. But at the time, people were saying, why would you photograph just the way the world looks now? I don't see much nostalgic in my work. I see there's nostalgia in some people who look at the pictures from then. But when I photographed a commercial strip in the 70s, it's just what the world looked like. It wasn't nostalgia. And you can't help time passing. Time passes. Well, the most important photographer for me, just in my development, was Walker Evans. and for a number of reasons. One, I was just very fortunate to have been given his book, American Photographs, for my 10th birthday. So it was the first photography book I ever owned. But I think there is, I think there's an affinity that I have for his work that goes beyond just a matter of influence. I think there's a sensibility. There's a kind of formalism and classicism, a restraint that is just a matter of temperament that we both have in common. You're also showing a work by Auger, who is another artist that is one of my very, very favorite photographers, and had a big impact on me. But no one had the influence that Evans did.
I also get same comments like Stephen get, like, why you photograph these places, or are you looking for heritage or old places? I said, no, this is not old. This is the place we are living in, you know. But I feel that it's important, like, you know, to photograph, because maybe it's not for us important today, but 40 years later, somebody will be interested, will be interested to see how life was before 30 years. Like what I did with my reverse moment. I looked at pictures. There are some pictures, maybe like technically it wasn't that great, but because I saw it, and it gave me like a picture or a window to how people looked like, or how life was. I wanted to do recently during the pandemic and before that, and I was researching, about performance art and how to come out of this documentary photography, thinking of and coming to do a very conceptual art photograph, which is, again, it is different from what I'm doing.
Ammar, as I understand you're incorporating performance now into your practice, I know a huge inspiration was derived from Hassan Sharif and his early performance works in the 1980s in Dubai. Can you share with us a bit more about this?
Actually, his intention was more, to break that traditional way of making art with all the group that was here in the 1970s and 80s, and to break that with these artwork that we see from a simple movements, but it's a different perspective of doing art, like jumping in the desert, like to show a landscape of the place, but at the same time to do things that is in his environment. You see, you hear a sound which is coming and moving, and how it is, and he only documented it with the pictures because it was not done in public. It was done for his brother and his other friends, and they were like going, and he was doing a performance in front of them, and his brother was taking these pictures. I wanted to do this continuous shot, which you see, and to show this cinematic movement, but with pictures, and at the same time to show that how as if you're seeing negative with the 35 pictures. I asked Stephen this question: did you reach one time in your life that you want to leave whatever you were doing, like documentary photography or concept, and try something different, something new? Which honestly, from end of last year and this year, I'm thinking about this a lot now, to stop going out and document things, and to think about different concepts, producing work which is look different also from my previous work.
Yes.
This is now a stage, and I want to ask maybe Stephen if he had this moment in his life.
This goes back to a question Suzy asked a while ago about how do you keep it going? And I was aware from an early age that a lot of even the best photographers had relatively short productive periods. That there's something about photography that this happens, and I mean even the most important photographers. And yet there were other people who had long productive lives, and they tended to fall into two categories. One, people who had visions that were so overwhelming that it just propelled them forward for decades. And I'm thinking of Auger and the Beschers, for example. And then there are other people who had long productive lives because they went through different periods and gave themselves new visual challenges. And I'm thinking of Alfred Stieglitz and Walker Evans. And I knew that by temperament, I was in that latter category. And so whenever I found myself beginning to repeat myself, where I could almost do pictures by rote, I would stop and do something different. And Suzy's picking a picture now to show that is a natural landscape. And this was an example of one of those changes that at one point I found that I could drive to any city and set up a camera at an intersection, and I knew exactly where to set up the camera, exactly where to how to frame the picture. There were no problems anymore. I could do it almost automatically. And when I realized that, I knew it was time to stop. And so I wanted to deal with something different and began natural landscapes, which was very different from what I had done before. And so it was, sometimes it's a different tool. I mentioned earlier that certain cameras offer particular possibilities that other cameras don't. Even the iPhone does. With an iPhone, it focuses very close, like a foot away. You can hold it in places you couldn't hold a camera you had to look through. I can hold it up here like this and take a picture. I can right on the ground. So I can take pictures that I couldn't take with another camera. So sometimes it's simply switching a camera. For a period in the 90s, for a decade actually, I worked just in black and white. I realized in 91 that I had spent 20 years working in color and hadn't worked in black and white in 20 years. So I decided, okay, for the next decade, I'll work in black and white. And Suzy showed one of the pictures in New York City panorama before. Mm-hmm. So that's my answer to your question. The answer is yes, and that and it's been hard. It's hard sometimes because when I stopped doing Uncommon Places, I had two dealers who stopped representing me because they wanted me to continue to do the work that they were used to. They didn't want me to change. So there was economic pressure not to change. Yeah. But that wasn't interesting for me as an artist.
Thank you both Stephen and Ammar for this conversation. I hope this time opened up old memories from both of your earlier days in your practices and since when you last saw each other almost 10 years ago. We touched upon photography history, perceptions of photographers, and uncovering how to actually see in a photo itself, which ties nicely in how you both capture photos of reality, which is so important in building awareness and bringing attention to the here and now. It's something we can all learn from today. Thank you, Ammar and Stephen. And Stephen, the UAE welcomes you back for a nice photography adventure again.